tonight is an overview on the history of photography. To complement Eugene's talk tonight, I'm going to start with a quick virtual tour of the Lambton Heritage Museum's Capturing the Moment exhibit. We haven't been able to share this exhibit with a lot of in-person visitors this year, so I want to take this opportunity to give you a quick virtual tour of the exhibit we've got at the museum that launched this lecture series. And hopefully if we have a chance to reopen and you can get to the museum to see it in person, the exhibit will be up until April 10th. I'm just going to share my screen here. So I welcome you virtually to the Lambton Heritage Museum. I do apologize for the quality of the video, which I admittedly took with a shaky hand and a cell phone. We're all learning and getting better at living in a digital world during this pandemic, and we're slowly purchasing better tools to better support our virtual programs. The focus of this exhibit is specifically local. It highlights artifacts and prints from Lambton County's early photography studios and the work of present-day photographers. We examine how the technology of photography has changed over time, as well as the people who can be photographers and the reasons we take photographs. In our introduction here, you can see some incredible pictures taken at a photography studio in Oil Springs. I love the fun and playfulness that comes out of those pictures. It's something you don't often see in early photography. In our focus on the beginning section, we look at how specialized photography was in its infancy. Equipment was expensive and bulky, and the development process was very complicated. Photography was confined mainly to the studio. In this picture, you can see the interior of George Haddon's photography studio in Alvinston from about 1905. Look carefully at the studio camera in the middle of the picture, because when we scan to the left, you can see that very camera, which is now part of the Lambton Heritage Museum's collection. This camera was first used in Haddon's studio, and then in the studio of William Coos in Sarnia, before passing on to the Kilbreth studio, and ultimately to Lambton Heritage Museum. And it's become a fine piece in our permanent collection. We have on display examples of early types of prints and negatives, including these mirror-like and delicate daguerreotypes. They feature Charlotte and Alexander Vital of Sarnia. The Vital family is often referred to as one of the founding families of Sarnia. We have several collections of glass plate negatives at the museum, including this image of Bloss Corey from Petrolia. The glass plate negative produced an incredibly sharp and clear image. I was really impressed at the quality of the print that we got after we scanned that negative. Over here, we have an album full of tintypes, which were a much cheaper form of print that peaked in popularity in the 1860s and 1870s. The family album is full of tintypes, but unfortunately, we don't know the family name or where most of the pictures were taken. So they are interesting keepsakes, but they would be more valuable to us if we had more context about them. Cabinet cards came into style in the 1870s, and one of the fascinating things about them is that they usually included the name of the photography studio and the photographer's stamp. These two cabinet cards feature the McCune family of Euphemia and Brook townships, and you can see they were produced by William Quartermass's photography studio in Alvinston. This folding plate camera takes us forward in the evolution of photography technology. This model held a single glass plate with the accordion section or bellows, and you folded out the camera to take pictures. This model was popular between the 1890s and 1930s, and this particular camera was used by photographer George Hess of Zurich. He regularly traveled to and photographed in the areas around Grand Bend. Moving forward to the next section of the exhibit, we are going to see a stereoscope, which is an interesting piece of technology that was introduced in the 1850s. It allowed the viewer to look through the lenses and see a three-dimensional image. Stereoscopes often featured pictures from exotic locations to allow viewers to see other parts of the world. Sometimes they had scenes from children's stories and poems or comical animations. Photography allowed people to experience different parts of the world, especially in the years before international travel was so easy and convenient. International drillers from Lambton County traveled around the world and introduced oil drilling techniques in the 1870s and until the 1930s. Many of the oil men who traveled around the world brought home incredible pictures of their journeys. In the top picture seen here, international driller William Gillespie poses in front of the pyramids in Egypt. And below, you can see his home in Borneo, which he called a real jungle house, or what they give you when you work on a wildcat well. If you want to learn more about the international drillers and to see some incredible artifacts they brought home from their travels, you can visit the Oil Museum of Canada in Oil Springs. Moving along to the next section of the exhibit, we examine one of the primary ways the public interacted with photography during the 20th century. A popular format of negatives for newspapers was the 4 inches by 5 inches. This size negative allowed direct contact printing when the print that results is the same size as the original negative. You can see here 2 negatives from the Sarnia Observer newspaper, which were reproduced below. The newspaper where those pictures were published is also on display. This paper documented Queen Elizabeth's visit to Sarnia in 1959. Thousands and thousands of negatives taken by Sarnia Observer reporters over the years have been donated to the Lambton County Archives in Wyoming, including these 2 examples, which are now on loan to us at Lambton Heritage Museum. You can search a lot of these negatives in the archive's online catalog at www.lambtonarchives.ca. As the technology behind photography became more simple and accessible, more people were able to become photographers. This Brownie camera was made at the Canadian Kodak Company manufacturing plant in Toronto. The camera was affordable and easy to use and ushered in a new generation of photographers. People were able to take informal snapshots using this technology. No experience or complicated development process was necessary. I would love to see you put a shout out in the chat if your parents or grandparents owned a Brownie camera or if you owned one yourself. Camera technology continued to be streamlined and improved. This Argus 21 camera used 35mm film and was manufactured between 1947 and 1952. This particular camera was used at the Kilbreth studio in Sarnia. Point-and-shoot cameras were easy to transport and could take pictures in many different settings. They complemented a desire to capture the formal moments in life as well as spontaneous events. Steeped in nostalgia is the next item on display, the Polaroid camera. This was also used at the Kilbreth studio in Sarnia. This particular model was produced beginning in 1982. There was nothing quite like the thrill of watching a Polaroid develop in front of your very eyes. Another component of this exhibit is our Comparing the Moment gallery. We partnered with members of the Port Franks Camera Club and the Petrolia Camera Club to bring new life to old pictures. After selecting some great archival images from the museum collection, we tasked these 2 clubs with taking a modern equivalent of that archival image. Sometimes the modern equivalent is a mirror image of the old picture or taken at the same location in the same angle. In other cases, the photographer provided a new perspective on an old picture. You can explore all of the submissions to our Comparing the Moment gallery in a video on the feature exhibit webpage on our website. I'll put that link in the chat momentarily. So thank you for joining us on that quick video tour. I hope you can find an opportunity to visit the exhibit in person sometime before April 10th, once the museum can reopen safely under provincial regulations. Stop sharing my screen. So tonight I'm joined by Eugene Pruski of the Port Franks Camera Club. Eugene is a retired electrician for Go Transit in Toronto. His hobby has been photography since he was about 16 years old. He started with film cameras and used to develop his own images in a darkroom. He's been a member of several photo clubs, including the Port Franks Camera Club since 2015. Prior to that, he was a founding member of the North Durham Photography Association in Port Perry, Ontario. Photography is his passion, and he loves learning new techniques as the processes keep evolving. He enjoys processing the images as much as taking them. Eugene, thank you for being with us tonight. Feel free to share your screen and begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dana. That was a nice presentation you had. I'm hoping I can enlighten people a little bit on some of the nuances of how photography actually came about, because it's a fascinating topic. Photography, it literally means drawing with light, and it was first coined by Sir John Herschel in 1839. He took it from the Greek words meaning phos, which means light, and gravs, which means drawing. And many people actually think that the very first photographic images were daguerreotypes. However, the process actually began at least 2,500 years ago with the camera obscura, which is this here. It's Latin for dark room. And it's the phenomenon that happens when you take an image, you have an image outside which is projected through a hole in a wall, and the room has to be dark, and it's projected on the other side of the on the wall on the other side. Now the image is it's upside down. It's basically, and it was the earliest known record of this phenomenon is a description by Han Chinese philosopher Mozi, who lived from 470 to 391 BC. And he correctly asserted that the image in the camera obscura is inverted because light travels in straight lines, as is shown here. So basically this part here would be on the bottom, this part would be on the top, and vice versa on the sides. And the artist would trace the images in the dark room, and they would later go back to finish them in their studios. And then the original camera obscuras were limited. They limited the artist to one location, basically. They had to be, because these things were very difficult, obviously, to move. There was a fairly large room because a person had to fit inside it. And so they could move it to a different scene, or they could literally have people standing in front of it so they could trace them. In the early 1600s, the astronomer Johann Kepler, he sketched in a small black tent, which is at the bottom here. And it had a convex lens on top to be able to focus the image, and also had a mirror which would invert the image to the proper proportions. This type of camera obscura was still in use until actually the early 19th century. Athanaeus Kircher, a Jesuit scholar and professor in Rome, described the camera obscura right here, which would be light enough to be carried on poles by two men. Now, I can imagine today's photographers complain sometimes about the size of their cameras. This is a little bit, I guess, makes us feel a little bit bad about how we feel. The camera obscura went through many stages of advancement, and mainly for portability. And this is here. So they basically did a lot of different setups so that they would be able to trace whatever was in front of the image. Artists who were thought to have used this different forms of camera obscura were Rembrandt, Leonardo da Vinci, Paul Rubens, Johann Vermeer, Vincent van Gogh, and Paul Gauguin. I guess they could be considered the very first photographers. And they would basically sketch their images in a camera obscura and then go out and finish the image in their studios. Since the middle of the 17th century, the existing optical apparatus could have been used for today's photography. From the chemical point of view, it wasn't until in 1725, Johann Schultz, a professor of anatomy at the University of Altdorf near Nuremberg, observed that the darkening of silver salts was not due to the sun's heat, but to exposure to light alone. He worked with this theory for quite a while, but never equated it with the permanent fixing of an image. Near the end of the 18th century, Thomas Wedgewood, he was the son of the potter Josiah Wedgwood, and he was an amateur scientist, conceived some of the same ideas. But he would trace images of country houses in a camera obscura, and then he would later transfer them to ornamental dinner and tea services at the Eritrea Pottery Works. His knowledge of the light sensitivity of silver nitrate was acquired from his tutor, Alexander Chisholm. When making photographic film, silver nitrate is treated with halide salts of sodium or potassium to form insoluble silver halide in photographic gelatin, which is then applied to strips of triacetate or polyester. Now, I I don't know exactly how to explain all of that, but it's that is the process that happens when a film is developed. And Wedgewood's main objective was to fix the image of the Camera Obscura onto silver nitrate, but he initially failed to do so in what he considered a moderate time. Wedgewood managed to make copies of leaves and insects' wings by simply layering them on paper or white leather, which was sensitized with silver nitrate or silver oxide. However, the pictures were unfixed and could only be viewed by candlelight, otherwise they would just darken all over. They failed to realize that ammonia could have dissolved the silver chloride unaffected by the light and could have been used to fix the image so it could have been viewed. The first experiments with the photographic process were by Nicephore Niepce in 1793. He experimented with different processes, but nothing ever came of them other than a few letters to friends referring to the different processes. He lost interest in the ideas for a while, but in 1813, 8 years after Wedgwood's early death, Nicephore Niepce, now living in retirement, renewed his interest in the photographic processes. They were known as Heliographer, which is a sun drawing. In 1826, he made a successful print with a camera supplied by a Parisian optician. This is the print right here. It was the view from Niepce's workroom window, and the exposure was thought to be about 8 hours. It is known as the oldest surviving photograph, and it is on display at the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center at the University of Texas. He died destitute in July of 1833. His son, Isidore Niepce, signed an agreement with Louis Daguerre. Daguerre had collaborated with Nicephore Niepce, and he experimented further and came up with a method to reduce the exposure time from 8 hours to 20 to 30 minutes. He called it a daguerreotype, believing that it was not his invention and not Niepce's. Initially, photography was frowned upon by purists, believing that it took away from the artistic ability and made the image mechanical. Many experiment with different substances to fix the images onto glass plates or paper. A cousin of Nicephore Niepce experimented with glass plates and brought the exposures down even farther. This process was not usable for portraits due to its long exposure times, 20 to 30 minutes. Glass plates were used for a long time, but the disadvantages were that you had to carry a large amount of equipment, as shown here. And so that you had to be able to coat the plates prior to the exposure, and then you had to process them in a darkened environment. The coming to life of the daguerreotype process was preceded by numerous inventions in the history of photography, as noted previously. Prior to the first half of the 18th century, Daguerre collaborated closely with Niepce after he used heliography or sun drawing to capture his own image. And after Niepce's death in 1833, Daguerre continued to the work on his own, with Niepce's experiments as the backbone of his own. By 1839, Daguerre sought a patent for his work from the French government. And on August 19th of that year, his process was presented at a joint meeting of the French Academy of Sciences and the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Today, many describe this event as the birth of photography. And what's interesting is that William Fox Talbot announced his very similar silver chloride sensitive paper method just a couple of months later. Had he done that a bit earlier, he would likely have replaced Daguerre as the inventor of photography. However, the invention of the daguerreotype, although frowned upon by purists, hit the New World by storm. Many new innovations came about through experimentation by many scientists. They managed to get exposures down to 3 to 5 minutes, which made them usable for crude portraiture. Morris and Draper managed to get daguerreotypes which survive to this day. The earliest known is of Draper's sister, taken in June of 1840. It measures 3.5 by 2 3/4. It was almost destroyed in the 1930s when a curator tried to clean it. It was restored afterwards, but with some loss of detail. The curator actually had worked on other daguerreotypes, later ones, and he had been able to clean them. But when he tried to work on this particular one, it was an earlier process and basically almost destroyed the image. But they were able to save it. The exposure was 65 seconds. By the early 1840s, portrait studios abounded in many American cities. Many itinerant daguerreotypists travel around to small towns taking portraits for a fee. Prominent early daguerreotypists included Charles Meade, M. Lawrence, Jeremy Gurney, and Matthew Brady, all of whom were based in New York. Brady famously took many pictures during the Civil War, these are some of his, and these are his images as well of Abraham Lincoln and Edgar Allan Poe. And as you can see, they actually survived to this day, which is quite incredible. And they used the huge view cameras in most cases, which needed very special care, as the plates had to be prepared in a dark tent and exposed only when inserted into the camera. And then you had to basically, this is your view camera here. So basically this is where the plate had to be inserted, and the plate, the actual film itself was protected on both sides. Then they had to remove the plates, expose the actual glass negative, and then once they had the right amount of exposure time, they would close the plate again, and then they would be able to pull it out and do the processing after that. The rapid gelatin dry plate came into general use in 1879-80. It greatly simplified photographic technique and also revolutionized equipment. During the 1880s and 90s, a variety of cameras were produced for use with dry plates and cut film type. The change box camera, right here, it had a plate changing box attached, usually held a dozen plates and sometimes cut film. There was the magazine type camera, which is here. It's a little bit later one. And it had 12 plates or 40 sheets of film stored in a magazine, with the plate being changed by a variety of mechanisms. Then there was the reflex cameras. Now this one is a little bit later, but you actually, with the reflex camera, you had a mirror up at the top. You could see through this lens, and this is the actual lens that took the image. So you could sort of see what you were taking a picture of. And then, of course, the Brownie camera and roll film cameras. They eventually replaced change box cameras, magazine cameras, because they used flexible film instead of glass plates, and it was wound between two spools. The first camera to introduce roll film was the Kodak, and it was introduced by George Eastman in August of 1888. The name Kodak was an invention of George Eastman because his favorite letter was K, and he wanted a name that started and ended with K. The camera was a wooden box, 6.5 by 3.5 by 3.5 inches, with a rectilinear fixed focal lens, which gave a sharp focus to anything beyond 8 feet. You could return the camera to Kodak for developing and printing, and you would get your prints along with a new camera fully loaded with film. Kodak's slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." George Eastman held a virtual monopoly on nitrocellulose roll film. Many different cheap cameras appeared, which were considered a status symbol for amateurs during the 1880s and 1890s. Craze towards detective cameras happened during this era. The lenses of these cameras were of poor quality, and their images were too small to be of any practical use, but they did start a trend toward miniaturizing the camera. The camera was a precision instrument and it could not come about until about 1924. Thomas Edison was instrumental in the development of the film industry. He experimented with different methods of capturing movement. Edward Muybridge had made motion images, but he used several cameras to achieve this and then stitched them together to create the illusion of motion. Edison used the studios to improve the process. His input helped improve speed of the photographic process so that movies became possible. Films were 35 millimeters in size, and this became a standard for a very long time. The mass production of 35 millimeter film for the cinema industry created a craze for developing better still cameras. A precursor to the Leica camera was developed by George P. Smith of Missouri in 1912. In 1914, the prototype of the Leica was constructed by Oskar Barnack, a microscope designer at Leitz in Wetzlar, Germany. And this was one of the early Leicas. With the Leica, the era of the true miniature camera began. However, the quality of the film had to catch up to the quality of the lenses. Eventually, in 1931, film developers started to improve the resolving power of the films of the day and made enlargements practical. It is similar to what has happened with the television industry, going from black and white to what we have today in HD TVs. There were still plate cameras in use because of their ability to capture images in low light situations. The glass plate was 4.5 by 6, and the lenses were f1.8 and f2, which allowed for low light situations. The Rolleiflex came on the market in 1929 by Frank and Heideke Brunswick. It was the precursor of many twin lens reflex cameras. They had two lenses, and as I explained earlier, the one was used for viewing the subject, and the other was actually for taking the picture. Initially, they all had one disadvantage of only having one focal length lens fixed on the camera. Through the years, this was improved so that lenses became interchangeable. The Hasselblad was a 6 by 6 centimeter single lens reflex camera, which came into predominance after World War II. They are still manufactured in Gothenburg, Sweden. It is still considered one of the best resolution cameras due to the quality of the lenses and the size of the negatives. As with digital, film size did matter. The larger the original negative, the better the resolution of the finished image, because the negative, this is an enlarger. The negative goes in here, and you basically go onto your, whatever your, usually the photographic paper goes down here. And the larger the film or the negative, the closer you can get to your paper, and you get a better resolution because there's more detail available in the image. Many photographers, such as Yusuf Karsh and Ansel Adams, still use view cameras, which had very large negatives. The negatives were actually 8 by 10 in some of these cameras. When transferring a negative to a finished print, it has to be done in a darkroom. For black and white, a red safe light could be used for color. For color, it must be done in complete darkness. The enlarger has a negative in a holder, and the image is projected onto sensitized paper. Once the paper has been exposed for a set period of time, it is processed in different chemicals, which eventually fix the image onto the paper. In black and white, trays with each chemical are used. There's a developer, a stop bath, a fixer, a clearing agent, and then there's a tray with flowing water, which removes any of the excess chemicals that are left over. Color has to be exposed in a complete dark room, and then the paper is put into a light-tight drum where the chemicals are poured into it and rolled for a specific time for each of the chemicals. The first time I have made black and white and color images with an enlarger, and the first time you actually see a black and white print coming out in the tray, it is a fascinating experience. It really is quite something. Initially, a lack of color in photographs was considered a drawback, because the process could only capture light and shade of images. In the late 1800s, some photographers would paint over daguerreotypes to represent color. James Clerk Maxwell, in May of 1861, demonstrated that every possible shade of color could be represented by the three primary colors of red, blue, and green. Right here, red, blue, and green. Lucas du Heron proposed the subtractive method of color photography. The pigments absorb or subtract from light all colors except their own, which they reflect. The subtractive method, or negative, was patented in 1869. Ducos du Heron managed to get a color photograph known as View of Angoulême in 1877. That's this one down here. It survives to this day. It is a very crude photograph. I tried to find out where it actually is still available, and I couldn't find anything anywhere to actually say where it is. I'm assuming it's in sort of a photographic museum. The turning point in practical color photography was the color screen process patented in 1904 by Auguste and Louis Lumière. Their glass plates were coated with microscopically small grains of starch dyed green, red, and blue. They were then re-exposed to light through different color filters, which would bring out the images. It was known as autochrome. The major disadvantage over black and white was that the exposures were very, very much longer. Color motion picture film refers both to unexposed color photographic film in a format suitable for use in a motion picture camera, and to the finished motion picture film ready for use in a projector, which bears images in color. The first color cinematography was by additive color systems, such as the one patented by Edward Raymond Turner in 1899 and tested in 1902. Simplified additive system was successfully commercialized in 1909 as Kinemacolor. These early systems used black and white film to photograph and projected two or more component images through different color filters. During 1920, the first subtractive practical color processes were introduced. These also used black and white film to photograph multiple colored filter sources image. So basically what they would do, each of the images would be shot through a different color filter, and then they would be exposed after that to get the color process. Before 1932, when three-strip Technicolor was introduced, commercialized subtractive process were only two color and could only reproduce a limited range of color. In 1935, Kodachrome was introduced, followed by Agfacolor in 1936. They were intended primarily for amateur home movies and slides. These were the first films of the integral tripaxis type, coated with 3 layers of different color sensitive emulsion, which is usually what is meant by the words color film as commonly used. The few color photographic films still being made in the 2010s are of this type. The first color negative films and corresponding print films were modified versions of these films. They were introduced around 1940, but it only came into wide use for commercial motion picture production in the early 50s. Of course, we know that the first color movie was Gone with the Wind, which was in 1939. In the US, Eastman Kodak's Eastman Color was the usual choice, but it was often rebranded with another trade name, such as Warner Color for Warner Brothers by the studio or the film processor. Later color films were standardized into 2 distinct processes: Eastman Color -2 chemistry, camera negative stocks duplicating interpositive and internegative stocks, and Eastman Color +2 chemistry. Again, these are just different inventions. Film was the dominant form of cinematography until the 2010s, when it was largely replaced by digital cinematography. Another process which became available was the Polaroid lens system. Down here, that's the earliest one. It produced a finished color print in about 60 seconds. Throughout these times, the cameras were becoming more and more sophisticated. Interchangeable lenses, along with the ability to adjust shutter speeds and focus points, became prevalent. The first practical through the lens camera was the Rolleiflex in 1928, which was the one I showed you earlier. In 1952, the Asahi Optical Company introduced the first Japanese SLR using 35mm film. They later became Pentax. Originally, we had rangefinder cameras, which gave you, these are rangefinders. They gave you a small view. You could basically, you had to look through here to see what your image would be, and the lens, it was where your image was actually being taken. Later came single lens reflex cameras, which gave the user the ability to see their subject through the lens. They had a mirror inside, which would show your image through the lens and then flip up to expose the film for the desired time. Several other manufacturers entered the market in the 50s. Pentax, Canon, Nikon, and Yashica were among them. The Nikon became the first with a full range of interchangeable lenses. Their film cameras were predominant in journalistic photography, and were also used by advanced amateurs. Then we come to the digital age. In December of 1975, Stephen Sasson, an engineer at Kodak, snapped the very first digital image. It took 23 seconds to record a 100 by 100 pixel image, which is 0.01 megapixels. And it went to a cassette tape. Digital cameras came about because of the American space program. They needed a faster method of transmitting images than film. They didn't want to have to wait for the film to come back down from space before they had to expose it and all that. So they wanted to get the images faster. The first electronic satellite was launched in 1976, and it had a resolution of 0.64 megapixels. Electronic cameras were introduced in 1986 with the Canon RC701. That's this one right here. And it was 0.4 megapixels. They were rumored to have been first tested at the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, and because news outlets wanted a quick way to transmit images. The quality was not that important because the resolution in newspapers was of little importance. The first of commercially available digital model was possibly the Megavision Tessera, which was in 1987. So there is no documentation of one ever actually being sold. In the US, the Dicam Model 1 sold in November 1990. It was a flop. It sold for $1,000 and was the only black and white. It was only black and white and with very low resolution. I couldn't find an image of that one. In 1991, Kodak started selling the digital camera system. It sold for $13,000 and had a 1.3 megapixel sensor and bulky external storage. This was the storage, basically. That's where the images were stored. Kodak dropped their digital camera production to continue focusing on film. I think this was probably a corporate mistake on their part. All of the major film camera manufacturers eventually switched over to the digital process. The software became available to process their images. New developments continued to be introduced in updates. Most manufacturers supplied software with their cameras for processing, but companies like Adobe revolutionized the industry with their Photoshop and Lightroom programs. Corel also supplies processing software, which is called Paint and Draw. It's not as dominant as Adobe. It is quite good, but it's not as dominant. New developments continue to be introduced in updates to these software programs. That is why I still have about 50,000 images on my computer, because I keep thinking that improvements will be able to save some of my rejected photos. One of the latest improvements is called a neural filter in Photoshop, which can actually change the expression on a person's face. You can actually turn a frown into a smile, or you can open their eyes, or you can actually show their teeth, and if they don't have them open, it is an incredible advancement. Other innovations are high dynamic range, which is basically where you take different images, different pictures of the same scene at different exposures, and then you bring them together into Photoshop, and they're combined, so you get the full range from shade to highlights are all properly exposed. And also there is what's called focus stacking, which is basically you can take up to 250 images all at different locations in the image, and then you bring them together into the software, and the entire image is in focus when you do that. There's also panorama stitching, which is where you take 4 or 5 images side by side and you can stitch them together. And the latest trend is also towards artificial intelligence, which looks at your image and it suggests settings to give you a starting point for your processing. Many companies are bringing out new cameras on a regular basis. Nikon, Canon, Sony, etc., all major players in the digital photography field with new innovations coming out constantly. Sony has become a predominant force in the digital photography. They supply most of the sensors used in modern cameras. The main objectives now are better resolution as well as better focusing systems. We now have cameras with 50 to 60 megapixel sensors, with some going up to 120 megapixels. Those are just still experimental. I don't think they're available. They may be available, but they are quite expensive. Film cameras were mostly manual systems, like where you actually had to set the exposure and you had to focus by turning a dial on the camera. You had to do it manually. They had built-in meters to help you with your exposure, and they had focusing aids to sort of help you make sure you got your the focus correct. But it was up to the photographer to set them correctly. Digital cameras today do most of that for you. It's still up to the photographer to learn how to use the settings properly, but it is much more sophisticated than in film cameras. As George Eastman would say, you push the shutter and the camera does the rest. The latest trend is toward mirrorless cameras, which are basically SLRs, which are single lens reflex without the mirror inside. You look through the viewfinder and you are actually looking at a miniature screen with your image on it. The main advantage is the size and the weight of the camera. Of course, phones have become quite prevalent as well. They're a convenient way to take photos. And as the old saying goes, the best camera in the world is the one you have with you. As with film, the major disadvantage to the phone and the point and shoot cameras is the sensor size. As you can see here, these are all the different sizes sensors. And this is the one right in the middle is what a smartphone has. All the other ones are basically, as you go to more expensive cameras, the sensor increases in size. There are different formats in images which give you different results. The standard is JPEGs, which basically lets the camera do all of or most of your processing. Some advanced photographers like to shoot in the RAW mode, which gives you much more information and much larger file sizes. They have to be processed in software to get a workable image, but you do get a lot more flexibility in the image when you are trying to process it. Photography has evolved into a major art form where images are now hung in museums and art galleries. Photographers have become artists and their work is revered for its artistic merit. One of Ansel Adams' prints sold recently for over $600,000. Of course, the same cannot be said of the paparazzi, who hound many of today's important people. They are a scourge on decency. You wonder if they would be around if they had to carry a camera obscura or even a view camera. New developments are continuous. And these are some of the examples of Mr. Karsh, who is, this is a celebrated portrait of Churchill. Annie Leibovitz, she has done a lot of the rock artists and all that. Ansel Adams, of course, with the Yellowstone National Park and all that. And we have our own Jeanette Bailey, who from Grand Bend, who does some phenomenal work. If you ever get a chance, you should really go to the gallery on River Road. She has a lot of her work displayed there, and it is well worth seeing. Photography has come a long way, but put on your sunglasses because the future of photography looks very bright. And that's basically it. What I used, a lot of my reference was A Concise History of Photography, which is a book by Helmut and Alison Gernsheim. And I used Wikipedia and Google for a lot of my research as well. Any questions?
Well, thank you, Eugene. That was very Very interesting. There was a question about film for Brownie cameras.
Yes,
What kind of film did Brownie cameras do, and is it still available?
they
And
use
could
the
you just-
120 size film, which is this larger film about, it's bigger than 35 millimeter. I'm not sure if it is available. I think it probably would be, but it might be a special order.
Could you stop sharing your screen, and then
Oh, sorry.
they can see our smiling faces?
Okay.
There was also a comment in the Q&A from David McLean. Hello, how are you? He, more of a philosophical comment, I guess, when you were talking about some of the early photographs that have lasted for almost 200 years. He said, I wonder how many photographs taken today will last as long as some of those early prints that are still around.
Well, I know the negatives, the color negatives in particular, are deteriorate fairly quickly. I think it's just the delicacy of them, and like mine are actually stored in the freezer because and they're in books, and they're in a special what's called archival sleeves, and they are very, very delicate. So I don't think they will last as long as the older ones, I guess, if we print them. But I really think the older processes will outlast the newer ones.
And I do see a comment in the chat. Someone said Amazon does sell 120 millimeter film.
Okay.
Cool. Another question here. This is from David Robinson. Do you think that those of us who have gone through film developing in our own darkrooms and to digital think it gives you an advantage? Or are you just some kind of old camera snobs? I often think that using a 4x5 camera and a spot meter gives them an advantage. Am I just an old guy who thinks the new photographers starting digital have missed something?
Well, I think you do have to learn a lot more with film because it's much more. Number one, you only have maximum of 36 exposures, and you have to take advantage of those exposures. Plus, you don't really see your result until you've actually developed it, and then you still have to go into a dark room and see what you're getting. So I think you have to know a lot more about photography, and I think you do miss a lot with just shooting digital because it cuts back a lot of the processes, and it reduces your knowledge of what you need to know how to take a good photograph.
Mm-hmm. See, Carrie in the chat here says, I teach photography in high school. We have a dark room and the students love it.
Yes, it's probably. I know some of my relatives who are getting into photography have asked to use some of my film cameras, and I have allowed them to use them because the kids are still using it, which is great.
I see in the chat a few people who are students at Fanshawe right now or having in Fanshaw's photography programs. So that's great.
Great.
Another question, is there a digital format that would rival medium format film?
Well, yes, there is actually. I would say there's actually the sensor in the Hasselblad, I believe is similar in size to the 6x6, which is like a larger format. And I really do think the digital format does rival it. As far as I really do think that the digital has overtaken film now, to be very honest.
Might be a related question. How is the dynamic range in film versus digital?
Well, film has less dynamic range. You have to, because you have to actually do your work in the dark room. Like I don't know if I ever explained. When you're actually working on a print in a dark room, you have to you do what's called dodging and burning, which is you actually use your hands and you can use different pieces of cardboard or whatever with holes in them to burn different areas into that image. And it's so it I don't know, it's a very the dynamic range in, that's what high dynamic range is in digital, where you can actually take up to 9-10 exposures and you get everything in the picture, in that photograph is properly exposed from the darkest area to the lightest area. So the dynamic range is actually larger in digital.
Thank you. Another comment here. It says, I graduated from Lambton College with Richard Belland and teach the basics of photography at Lambton in the dual credit program. This is more of a comment, but I never attended our history of photography class and regretted it. Richard was not the teacher at the time, but I know he uses many iconic techniques in some of his work. Yeah, if people want to see more about Richard Belland's work, he did the first lecture in our digital lecture series on photography, and that is available on the Lambton Heritage Museum YouTube channel. So check that out because it was a great lecture. Another comment here, Polaroid developed a large format instant camera that it rented out to famous photographers like Annie Leibovitz. Polaroid has archives of portraits that were taken with these cameras. The archives were in danger of being lost after Polaroid was forced out of business by digital. The irony of the story is that the archive was preserved by re-archiving with digital copies of the images. So the technology that put Polaroid out of business saved their archives. It's fascinating. I see another comment in the chat. I don't know if anyone can speak to this, but they said, I understand that Fanshawe College no longer has a dark room.
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
It's a shame if they don't, because I think it's a really great learning tool.
Mm-hmm. Another question, what parameters would you use to identify the best small sensors for 4x3?
Well, when you get into single lens reflexes, or even the new mirrorless cameras, there's APS-C is actually the smallest sensor they have in those. When you go to the more expensive cameras, they have what's called a full frame camera, which is the full frame is the same size as a 35mm film. And there's other ones, the more expensive ones go even to larger sensors. And the larger the sensor, the more information you actually get in your file. And then when you can crop it down, you still get enough information to be able to get a reasonably good image. If you have, like, the phone sensor is a very small sensor, like it's extremely tiny, even though they're 16 megapixels or whatever, but each of the pixels has very little information in it. So that's why it's the size of the sensor is much more important than the actual megapixels of a camera.
Great. Another question, are you still using the zone system of Ansel Adams?
I do, to a certain extent. I always try to watch for, well, obviously, because middle gray is where your camera meter is always, that's what it's looking for, is middle gray. So it'll expose it'll expose for middle gray. So you have to sort of concentrate. If you've got something that's got very, very white, you have to change your exposure. You have to either overexpose or slightly underexpose, depending on what your subject is. So you have to always think that your meter is actually shooting for middle gray. So it does, I do use the zone system, yes.
Just had a question about where to see the recorded presentations for the previous lectures that we did. So I've just shared that link in the chat. We'll also send out an e-blast to anyone who had registered for the presentation once the video for tonight is live. And in the e-blast, you'll see the links to all the previous lectures as well as tonight's lectures. So keep an eye in your email for that.
And you can include my email address if you'd like. If anybody has any more questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them for them.
That's great. Well, thank you so much to everyone who came out tonight and chose to spend your time with us learning about the history of photography. And thank you to Eugene for sharing your knowledge with us. It was really interesting. It's amazing to see how much photography has changed and evolved over the years. So,
well, thank you very much for inviting me. I was flattered, actually, and I really do appreciate the chance to actually investigate all of this, because I had to learn a lot from this as well.
Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for everyone who attended, and yeah, have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.